The junkyard smelled like rust and old rain. Diana Hartwell stepped out of her black Escalade heels, sinking slightly into gravel, and looked around with the kind of expression people reserve for things they've already decided aren't worth their time. 60-something dead trucks lined up in uneven rows. Weeds pushing through cracked concrete. A shop building with a roof that sagged in the middle like it was tired of holding itself up. She found Ethan Calloway standing next to a gutted Freightliner, a wrench in his hand, grease across his forearm. "I'll be direct," she said. "This place is garbage. Sell it before it drags you under." Ethan didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He took her business card, looked at it once, and slid it into his shirt pocket. Then he turned back to the truck. But before Diana reached her car, she glanced back just once. Ethan was crouching near the shop wall, picking something up from the ground. An old wrench handle, worn smooth from 30 years of use. His father's. He held it like it meant something. She almost said something. Instead, she got in the car and drove away. What happened next turned a condemned junkyard into $1 million operation. And it started with one man who refused to see what everyone else saw. If you've ever been told something you believed in was worthless, stick with this one. And if stories like this are what you're here for, subscribing takes 2 seconds and means you won't miss the next one. Ethan Calloway had spent 17 years learning how to keep trucks alive. He knew the sound a failing transmission made before the driver did. He could diagnose an engine by smell alone. Burnt coolant, cracked gaskets, oil pushed somewhere it had no business being. At Meridian Transport, he'd been the guy they called at 2 in the morning when a rig broke down 3 states away and a delivery couldn't wait. He was good at his job. He knew that. His supervisors knew that. None of it mattered when the restructuring hit. 22 people let go in a single afternoon. Ethan got a handshake, a folder of severance paperwork, and a parking lot to walk across alone. He was 40 years old, between homes, and his savings were built for emergencies, not for the kind of emergency where everything stops at once. 3 weeks later, his father died. Raymond Calloway had owned and operated Calloway's Yard for 31 years. Nearly 3 acres off Interstate 40, just outside Millhaven. It wasn't much to look at. It had never been much to look at. But Raymond had kept it running, through bad winters, slow seasons, and 2 recessions, without ever asking anyone for help. He'd fixed trucks alone, collected scrap metal alone, lived in a converted office at the back of the property, alone. When Ethan arrived to sort through his father's belongings, he found the place exactly as Raymond had left it, worn down, stubbornly functional, and completely his own. What Raymond left behind was 63 decommissioned trucks, 4 shipping containers, a shop building that needed serious work, and $220,000 in outstanding debt tied to the property. What he also left behind was a notebook. Ethan found it in the bottom drawer of the old metal desk in the back office. A water-stained spiral notebook, the cover soft from years of handling. Inside, in Raymond's tight, careful handwriting, was everything every truck logged, by year and condition. Every repair made and what it cost. Every dollar that came in and where it went. 31 years of a man showing up every single day and doing the work anyway. There was no entry that said quit. There was no page that suggested Raymond had ever considered it. Ethan put the notebook in his shirt pocket. He hadn't taken it out since. Dylan Calloway was 20 years old and didn't know what to do with himself. He'd lasted 1.5 years at State before the direction he thought he had dissolved into something he couldn't name. He wasn't failing. That would have been easier to explain. He was just absent in a way that didn't show up on transcripts. He came home, moved into the second bedroom of a short-term rental Ethan was holding on to, and spent most of his time avoiding the question his father never directly asked. "What are you going to do?" When Ethan said they were moving to the yard, Dylan didn't object. He also didn't pretend to be enthusiastic. He helped load the truck, rode in silence for most of the drive, and when they pulled through the gate of Calloway's yard for the first time, he looked out the window at 63 rusting trucks and said nothing at all. He didn't tell his father what he was actually thinking, that this place embarrassed him, that when people asked where he was living now, he'd already decided he wouldn't mention the junkyard. He just got out of the truck and started carrying boxes inside. Diana Hartwell didn't make a habit of showing up unannounced. She had people for initial contact: a logistics coordinator who handled property inquiries, an assistant who scheduled site visits, a legal team that drafted preliminary offers before she ever set foot on a location. The process was efficient. It kept emotion out of transactions that didn't need it. She came to Calloway's yard herself because she'd driven past it twice in the last month, and both times something about the location had stuck. 3 acres off Interstate 40, right at the junction where eastbound freight traffic slowed down and drivers started looking for services. No truck stop within 14 miles. No overnight parking within 20. The land itself wasn't impressive, but land rarely was before someone decided what it was for. She found Ethan in the shop underneath a Freightliner with a flashlight clenched between his teeth. She introduced herself. He came out from under the truck, wiped his hands on a shop rag, and listened without interrupting while she laid out the offer. The number was enough to cover the outstanding debt and leave him with roughly $40,000 after closing costs. Clean exit. No complications. "Why would I sell?" Ethan asked. Diana had answered that question before, in different rooms with different people. She gave him the same answer she always gave. Because this place has no future. You're looking at a property that's months away from bank seizure. The debt is real. The income isn't. At best, you're buying yourself a longer fall. She watched him take that in. What she expected was the calculation she always saw the moment someone ran the numbers against their pride and let the numbers win. It was nothing to be ashamed of. It was just math. What she got instead was stillness. Ethan looked at her for a moment, then looked around the yard, not with the expression of a man taking inventory, but with something slower. Like he was reading a place he already knew by heart. "My father ran this yard for 31 years, he said. He never missed a payment by more than 2 weeks. I know his record, Diana said. I'm not talking about your father. I'm talking about now. Ethan nodded once, as if she'd confirmed something he already suspected about her. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't tell her she was wrong. He just said, I'll think about it, in a tone that made clear he already had. Diana handed him her card and turned to leave. She was almost to her car when something made her look back. Ethan had crossed to the far wall of the shop and was crouching near a cluttered shelf. He reached past a row of oil cans and picked up a wrench that had no business still being in service. The handle was worn down to bare metal, the grip tape long gone. He turned it over once in his hand. It was the kind of object that only meant something to the person holding it. Diana stood there for 3 full seconds. Something shifted, not her position on the property, not the numbers, but something smaller and less definable. She recognized the look on his face. She just didn't have a name for it yet. She got in the Escalade and pulled out of the yard without looking back again. Ethan sat with Diana's business card on the desk in front of him for a long time that night. He didn't pace. He didn't make calls. He just sat in the back office of the shop building under a single bulb that buzzed faintly when the wind picked up outside, and looked at the card the way you look at something you already know you're going to put down. The offer was real. He understood that. $40,000 after closing wasn't life-changing money, but it was a floor, something to stand on while he figured out what came next. The bank wasn't going to wait forever. 90 days, the loan officer had told him before seizure proceedings began. Diana Hartwell had shown up with a solution that fit neatly inside that window. The logical move was obvious. He opened his father's notebook instead.
He didn't read it from the beginning. He opened it somewhere in the middle, to an entry from 11 years ago. A winter month, based on the note Raymond had made about frozen water lines in the shop. The entry listed 4 trucks serviced that week. 2 sold for parts. 1 towed in from the highway after a blowout. At the bottom of the page, in smaller writing than the rest, slow month, stayed open anyway. Ethan closed the notebook. He got up, took a flashlight from the shelf, and walked the yard. He moved slowly, row by row, shining the light into cabs and under chassis, checking frames and axles and what was left of each engine compartment. He wasn't looking at what was broken. He was looking at what was still there. 2/3 of the trucks had salvageable components: engines, transmissions, axles, body panels that could be stripped and resold. The 4 shipping containers were structurally sound. The shop building needed roof work and new lighting, but the concrete floor was solid, and the lift bit was intact. He walked to the front of the property and stood at the gate, looking out at the interstate. This stretch of I-40 handled significant freight volume. He knew that from his years at Meridian. He also knew that the nearest full-service truck stop was 14 miles east, and the nearest certified repair facility was 22 miles west. Between those 2 points, when something went wrong on the road, and things went wrong constantly, drivers had nowhere to go. No emergency pull-off with a shop, no secure overnight lot, no short-term storage for loads that needed to be held while a rig got repaired. Callaway's yard sat in the middle of that gap. Diana had looked at this land and seen debt and disorder. Ethan looked at it and saw a service area that didn't exist yet. He went back to the office, sat down, and turned Diana's business card face down on the desk. Then he pulled out a blank page from the back of his father's notebook and started writing, not a business plan, not yet, just a list. What was here, what it could do, what it would take to make it work. He wrote for an hour without stopping, and when he finally put the pen down, the list covered both sides of the page. He wasn't going to sell. He didn't call Diana to tell her. He didn't need to. He just turned off the light and got to work the next morning. The first week, Ethan sold his truck. It was a 2017 Ford F250 he'd bought outright 3 years earlier. The one thing he owned that had actual resale value. He got $19,000 for it, cash, from a contractor 2 towns over who didn't ask questions. He also pulled 12 of the most salvageable trucks from the yard inventory and spent 4 days stripping them down to components: engines, alternators, starters, brake assemblies, anything that could be cleaned up and listed. He sold parts through 3 different online platforms and 2 calls to local shops he dealt with back at Meridian. By the end of 10 days, he had just over $26,000 liquid. It wasn't enough to build anything. It was enough to start. He prioritized the Freightliner. First, a 2009 Cascadia that had been sitting under a tarp near the back fence. The engine needed a full rebuild. The electrical system had been partially gutted by someone who'd started a project and abandoned it, and the brakes were shot. Ethan worked on it every morning from 5:30 until the light failed, then switched to the shop lighting he'd rewired himself and kept going until midnight. He ate in the shop. He slept 4, sometimes 5 hours. Dylan watched from a distance. He helped when asked, handing tools, holding a light, running to the parts supplier in the borrowed pickup they were using since Ethan sold the F250. But he stayed at the edge of things. He answered his father's questions in full sentences and didn't complain about the conditions.
but there was a reservation in him that Ethan could see clearly and chose not to push. One evening around the third week, Dylan came into the shop to bring Ethan a plate of food and found him sitting on an overturned crate at the workbench, the notebook open in front of him. Ethan wasn't writing. He was just looking at a page near the middle one of Raymond's old entries, dense with the small, careful handwriting that had documented 3 decades of this place. His face was tired in a way that went past the physical. Dylan set the plate down without saying anything. He started to leave, then stopped in the doorway. "How far behind are we?" he asked. Ethan looked up. 60 days left on the bank window. Shop's close to operational. If I can get the Freightliner on the road in the next 2 weeks, we can start taking calls." Dylan nodded slowly. "And if you can't, I will." It wasn't said with bravado. It was said the way his father used to say things, flat and certain, like a measurement rather than a claim. Dylan looked at him for a moment, then at the notebook, then back at his father. He didn't say anything else. He just went back to his room. But the next morning, he was in the shop before Ethan. He'd pulled the wiring diagram for the Freightliner's electrical system from a database he'd found online, printed it out, and taped it to the wall above the bench. He didn't make a speech about it. He just pointed to 3 sections he'd flagged and said, "I think the fault's in one of these." He was right. It was the second one. They had the Freightliner running 11 days later, 4 days ahead of where Ethan had projected. When the engine turned over and held, neither of them said much. Ethan checked the gauges twice, listened to the idle for a full minute, then climbed down from the cab. He crossed to the shelf near the shop wall, picked up his father's old wrench, and held it out to Dylan. Dylan looked at it. "You earned it," Ethan said. "More than I did today." Dylan took the wrench. He didn't make a thing of it, just turned it once in his hand and set it carefully on the corner of the workbench. Not put away, but placed the way you place something you intend to keep close. In the days that followed, Ethan ran the Freightliner on short local hauls to verify the systems before putting it on the highway. 3 days of test runs, no load, just the truck and the road. By day 4, he was confident. By day 6, when the first real call came in, the Freightliner was ready. The bank window had 49 days left. But the yard was now generating income, parts sales, 2 overnight parking arrangements with local carriers, and a storage rental on one of the containers. It wasn't enough to retire the debt, but it was enough to demonstrate active revenue to the loan officer when Ethan called to report progress. The bank agreed to review the timeline at the 60-day mark, rather than proceeding directly to seizure. It was a narrow ledge, but it was a ledge. The call came in at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. Ethan was still in the shop, cleaning up after replacing a wheel bearing on one of the yard trucks, when his cell rang, an unsaved number with a Missouri area code. He almost let it go to voicemail. He picked up on the 4th ring. The man on the other end was a driver named Gary Pollard, and he was not having a good night. His refrigerated Kenworth had thrown a belt 31 miles east on I-40 and was now sitting on the shoulder with 4,000 pounds of frozen food product that needed to be at a distribution center in Millhaven by 6 in the morning. He'd called 3 roadside services. The first quoted him 4 hours. The second didn't pick up. The third told him they didn't handle refrigerated cargo transfers and wished him luck. Someone at a truck stop had given him Ethan's number. "I can't fix a Kenworth belt in the dark on the shoulder," Ethan said. "I know that," Gary said. "I need the load moved. I need someone with a rig big enough to take 4,000 pounds, and a driver who can get it to Millhaven cold chain intact." Ethan looked at the Freightliner parked 20 feet away. "Give me the mile marker," he said. Dylan was awake when Ethan came through the office to grab his logbook and jacket. He didn't ask for an explanation. He just looked at his father's face and said, You need me? Stay by the phone. If I call, pick up. The drive out was 20 minutes on empty roads. Gary Pollard was standing outside his truck in a reflective vest when Ethan pulled up, and the relief on his face was visible from 50 yards. The Kenworth was fully loaded, trailer seals intact, but going nowhere without a functioning belt and a shop that wasn't the shoulder of an interstate at midnight. They worked fast. Ethan had brought the hand truck moving straps and every blanket in the shop. Not enough insulation for a 4,000-pound cold transfer, but enough if they moved quickly and drove faster. He and Gary shifted the load in 40 minutes, stacking and securing in the Freightliner's trailer with the efficiency that comes from two people who understand freight and don't waste words. Ethan pulled out at 12:58. He made the distribution center in Millhaven at 5:42 in the morning, 18 minutes before the deadline. The receiving manager checked the load temperature, signed the paperwork, and looked at Ethan's truck. No company logo, no fleet markings, just a freshly painted cab with Callaway's Yard stenciled on the door in plain block letters. "You're not a carrier," the manager said. "Emergency recovery," Ethan said. "We're working on the paperwork." Gary Pollard posted about it that same afternoon on 2 different driver forums. Not a long post, just the facts, the situation, the name, the outcome. Within 48 hours, Ethan had 11 messages. Within the week, he had his first recurring client, a regional carrier out of Tulsa that ran I-40 twice a week and wanted a standing arrangement for emergency recovery and overnight parking. The new revenue, combined with the parts income, was enough. When Ethan called the bank at the 60-day mark, he had financial statements showing consistent incoming revenue and 2 signed service contracts. The loan officer granted a full extension. The 90-day clock stopped. Callaway's Yard was no longer dying. It was operating. Dylan set up a tracking sheet to log incoming calls, job types, and response times. He didn't announce it. He just put it on the desk one morning. By the end of the second week, he was managing the scheduling himself, fielding calls while Ethan was on the road, and cross-referencing the yard's available equipment against incoming requests with a speed and precision that surprised them both. Ethan watched his son work one evening from across the yard and said nothing. But that night, he opened his father's notebook to the last written page, Raymond's final entry 3 days before he died. And below it, on the first blank line, Ethan wrote a single date. The day Callaway's Yard took its first real call. Marcus Callaway showed up on a Wednesday morning without calling ahead. Ethan was under a Pete 379 when he heard the unfamiliar car pull in. He came out from under the truck and found his older brother standing near the gate, hands in his jacket pockets, looking around the yard with an expression that was trying to be casual and not quite managing it. They hadn't spoken since the funeral. Marcus had arrived the day after Raymond died, stayed long enough to confirm there was no liquid inheritance worth claiming, and left before the burial. Ethan had watched him go and said nothing. There was nothing to say. Marcus took his time getting to the point. When he finally did, it came out smooth and reasonable. He wanted to come in as a partner. 30% equity in exchange for capital investment. He had contacts, he said. He knew people in the regional freight industry. He could open doors that Ethan couldn't. "No," Ethan said. "You haven't heard the number yet." "It doesn't matter." "Ethan, you left the day after Dad died," Ethan said. "You didn't help with the burial. You didn't respond when the bank sent the notice. You signed away your claim to this property and walked out. That's done. Whatever this place becomes, you're not part of it." Marcus left without pushing further. Ethan went back under the peat. The posts started appearing 10 days later. Dylan found them first anonymous accounts on 2 driver forums, both recently created, both posting variations of the same claim that Callaway's yard was operating without proper commercial licensing, that the recovery vehicle wasn't registered for highway service, and that the yard was weeks away from being shut down by the county. The posts were written carefully, just vague enough to avoid being obviously false, just specific enough to sound like they came from someone with inside knowledge. The effect was immediate. 3 clients called to ask about the licensing status. 1 canceled a standing arrangement. The Tulsa carrier paused their contract pending clarification. Incoming calls dropped by more than half in 5 days. Ethan pulled the actual licensing documentation, confirmed everything was current, and started making calls. But correcting a rumor takes longer than starting one, and the damage was spreading faster than he could address it, one conversation at a time. Dylan didn't wait to be asked. He spent 2 days cross-referencing the posting account's creation dates, writing patterns, which forums they'd appeared on first, what other content they'd engaged with. He wasn't a forensic investigator, but he was methodical, and he was angry in the quiet way that produces results. On the 3rd day, he came to Ethan with a printed summary, 2 pages clean and specific, showing a clear pattern linking the anonymous accounts to activity originating from Marcus's known email address and a forum account Marcus had used under his own name 2 years earlier. It wasn't courtroom evidence, but it was enough. Ethan took the summary to 3 senior members of the driver community he'd built relationships with, men who'd been on the road for decades and had no patience for bad actors polluting their networks. He didn't make accusations. He presented the documentation and let them draw their own conclusions. Within a week, Marcus's name was known in the right circles for the wrong reasons. He didn't post again. He didn't call again. He simply stopped the way people do when they realize the ground has shifted and they have nowhere left to stand. Ethan didn't mention his brother after that. The chapter closed without ceremony, the way it deserved to. That evening, Ethan found Dylan at the scheduling desk, already back to logging calls. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Dylan didn't look up. He was focused on the screen, rebuilding the client list, 1 entry at a time. "Good work," Ethan said. Dylan looked up briefly. "We're not done yet." He was right. But something had changed. The distance that had lived between them since the beginning, the careful, unspoken space Dylan had kept, was smaller now. Not gone, but smaller. They both felt it, and neither said so. That was enough for now. The storm came down hard on a Thursday. The National Weather Service had called for 6 to 8 inches overnight. They got 14. By 9 in the evening, Interstate 40 was a parking lot. Trucks lined up on both shoulders for miles, visibility near zero, temperature dropping fast enough that diesel fuel was starting to gel in tanks that hadn't been treated for extreme cold. The county had closed 2 on-ramps. The state plows were running behind. Drivers who'd been moving freight 12 hours ago were now sitting in dark cabs, trying to figure out where they were going to sleep. Ethan heard about it on the radio before the first call came in. He was already pulling on his jacket when his phone rang. Dylan was at the scheduling desk within minutes, a headset on, a legal pad in front of him. He set up a simple intake system, on the spot. Driver name, mile marker, load status, immediate need, and started working through calls as they came in. Ethan and their 2 part-time crew members went out in the yard truck and the Freightliner, running recovery loops on the stretch of I-40 closest to the yard. The work was grinding and cold and unrelenting. They pulled a jackknifed flatbed off the shoulder around 10:30. They recovered a box truck that had slid into a drainage ditch at mile marker 214 just after midnight. Between runs, Ethan and the crew brought stranded drivers back to the yard, 7 by 1 in the morning, 11 by 2. Dylan had opened the two largest shipping containers, run extension cords from the shop,
set up space heaters, and a folding table with two commercial coffee urns they'd borrowed from a diner supply place in town 3 weeks earlier and never returned. It wasn't comfortable. It was warm and dry and out of the wind, and at 2 in the morning, on a night like that, warm and dry was everything. Dylan managed the interior operation without being asked. He tracked who was in each container, confirmed that loads requiring climate control were accounted for, relayed information between drivers who needed to reach their dispatchers, and kept a running log of every vehicle they'd brought in and its current status. Ethan noticed it on his third run back to the yard. He pulled in, checked the log Dylan had posted on the shop wall, and found it complete and current. He refueled, drank half a cup of coffee, and went back out. The call about the Hartwell trucks came in at 2:41. Dylan flagged it immediately. 4 Hartwell freight semis, a contracted convoy moving refrigerated pharmaceutical cargo, had come to a stop at mile marker 209, 2 miles east of the yard. Diana's emergency coordinator had called every recovery service within 50 miles. Most weren't operating. The ones that were had response times of 3 hours or more. Dylan had Ethan on the radio before the coordinator finished leaving the voicemail. Ethan was at mile marker 209 in 19 minutes. The 4 trucks were pulled over in a line on the right shoulder, hazard lights cutting through the snow. The lead driver, a man named Brent, came out to meet Ethan in the beam of the yard truck's headlights, and his relief was the relief of someone who'd stopped expecting help. "Pharmaceutical cargo," Brent said. "Temperature controlled. We cannot lose this load." "You won't," Ethan said. "Let's move." He assessed the situation in under 2 minutes. None of the 4 trucks had mechanical failures they'd stopped due to visibility and the road surface. What they needed was a pilot vehicle and a driver who knew this stretch of road well enough to move in these conditions. Ethan knew every foot of it. He radioed Dylan to prep 4 spaces in the main yard and clear the entry path. Then he pulled the yard truck in front of the lead Hartwell semi and led the convoy back at 15 miles per hour through the snow. All 4 trucks rolled through the gate of Callaway's yard at 3:22 in the morning. Diana arrived at 7:15. The storm had eased overnight, leaving everything gray and clean and still. She came through the gate in a company SUV and stopped just inside the entrance, looking at what was in front of her. The yard was occupied. Trucks parked in organized rows, her 4 semis among them. The shipping containers had drivers coming and going, coffee cups in hand. Dylan was at the exterior scheduling board, updating vehicle statuses, talking to a driver Ethan had never met before last night. The shop was open, warm light coming through the windows, the sound of an engine being checked inside. Callaway's yard looked at 7:15 in the morning, after one of the worst storms of the year, like a place that had been built for exactly this. Diana stood at the gate for a long moment. She looked at the containers, the parked trucks, the handwritten status board, the young man running logistics with a calm that didn't match his age. Then she found Ethan near the shop door, checking over the last of the Hartwell trucks. She walked across the yard and stopped a few feet away. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him that very first day, except this time, she wasn't calculating. She was just looking. "I was wrong about this place," she said. Her voice had none of the precision she used in offices. It was quieter than that, more considered. Ethan looked up from the truck. He didn't say, "I told you so." He just looked at her steadily, without performance. "Come inside," he said. "There's coffee." Diana's office was on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Millhaven that had her company's name on the exterior. Ethan had driven past it dozens of times without ever thinking he'd have a reason to go inside. He parked on the street, took the elevator up, and sat across from Diana at a conference table long enough to seat 12.
She had water and coffee waiting. He didn't touch either. She slid a folder across the table.
1.2 million, she said. All cash, 30-day close.
Ethan opened the folder and looked at the number. He didn't react to it, not visibly. He read the terms carefully, taking each line at its own pace, without letting the total at the bottom rush him.
The math was straightforward.
After paying off the remaining debt and closing costs, he would walk away with somewhere between $750,000 and $800,000. For a man who'd been staring at a 90-day bank ultimatum 8 months ago, that was a number that could change the shape of a life. He closed the folder.
Diana watched him.
She'd made significant offers before in rooms like this one to people in positions like his. She knew the usual arc, the pause, the attempt to negotiate upward, the eventual yes dressed up as a reluctant concession. It was a pattern she'd seen enough times that she'd stopped finding it interesting. Ethan wasn't following the pattern. "Why now?" he asked.
Because the yard is worth more now than it was 8 months ago, she said.
"You proved that. The storm coverage alone generated more regional visibility for that location than I could have bought with a marketing budget. I'm not offering 1.2 because I feel generous. I'm offering it because the asset has matured, and I want it before it matures further." Ethan nodded slowly. "So you understand what it's becoming?" "Yes." "Then you understand why I'm not selling it."
Diana was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone caught off guard, but the silence of someone recalibrating. She leaned back slightly in her chair and looked at him with an attention that was different from the first day, less transactional, more considered. "Walk me through it," she said. Ethan set the folder to one side. 1.2 is a single payment, he said. "I take it's done. I have capital, no property, no operation, and no position in an industry I've spent 20 years learning. The yard right now is generating recurring revenue from recovery contracts, overnight parking, short-term storage and parts. That revenue is growing because the infrastructure is in place and the reputation is built. A one-time payment, even a large one, doesn't compete with what this location produces annually over a 5-year horizon." He paused. "And there's something the number doesn't account for." Diana waited. "Dylan," Ethan said. "My son runs operations. He built the dispatch system. He manages client relationships. He knows this yard the way I know engines. 6 months ago, he didn't know what he was doing with his life. Now he does. That's not something I can put in a counteroffer, but it's real, and it factors into every decision I make about this property." The room was quiet. Diana looked at him for a long time. She knew what it looked like when someone was performing strength and when someone actually had it. Ethan Calloway was not performing anything. He had come into her building in a jacket that still had a faint grease mark on the left cuff, and declined $1.2 million with the same composure he'd used to pick up a wrench in a junkyard 8 months ago. He didn't need her to validate the yard. He didn't need her to validate him. He just needed her to understand that the place had value, and she already did. That was the problem, and also, she was beginning to think the point. "So," she said finally, "what are you proposing?" Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and set a single folded page on the conference table. Diana looked at it without touching it. "You wrote a term sheet by hand?" "It's a framework," Ethan said. "Your lawyers can formalize it." She unfolded it. 4 paragraphs, no excess language. Ethan walked her through it without being asked. Hartwell Freight would route all emergency recovery calls and short-term cargo storage needs within a 55-mile corridor of I-40 on both sides of Millhaven, to Calloway's yard on a preferred provider basis.
Revenue generated through those referrals would split 60% to Callaway, 40% to Hartwell as a routing fee. Diana's company would receive no equity stake in the property, no ownership interest of any kind, and no operational authority over how the yard was run. The arrangement would be reviewed annually and could be extended, modified, or dissolved by either party with 90 days' notice. Diana read it twice. "You're giving me 40% for making phone calls?" she said. "I'm giving you 40% for your network," Ethan said. "You have contracts with regional carriers I haven't reached yet. You have dispatch infrastructure and a reputation that takes years to build. I'm not paying for phone calls. I'm paying for access to a client base that accelerates what this yard becomes by 3 to 4 years." Diana set the page down. She thought about the first time she'd driven out to this property. The assessment she'd made from the gate, the certainty she'd felt. She thought about the number she'd put in the folder and the assumption behind it, that a man in Ethan's position would see $1.2 million and feel the weight of it the way most people did. She had been wrong about the yard. She had been wrong about him. Those were two separate errors, and she was careful enough with her own thinking to note them both clearly. "The corridor radius," she said, "55 miles is broad." "It's what the gap in service coverage requires," Ethan said. "But I'll add a performance clause, minimum response threshold on emergency calls, or preferred provider status is suspended, not terminated." Diana looked up. 30-day cure period. Agreed. She picked up a pen, made 2 annotations on the handwritten page, and initialed them. She slid it back across the table. Ethan read the changes, then initialed the same lines. It was not a binding contract. It was 2 people agreeing on paper that the thing they were building together was worth the risk of trusting each other. Diana had signed documents worth 50 times this amount without feeling what she felt, looking at that annotated page. "My legal team will have a formal agreement in 2 weeks," she said. "I'll have mine look at it," Ethan said. He stood, picked up the folded page, and put it back in his jacket pocket. The same pocket where his father's notebook had lived for the past 8 months. 8 months later, the sign above the gate read, "Callaway Logistics and Recovery Hub." The yard had been rebuilt from the ground up. The internal road was paved. The parking bays were marked and lit. 2 of the shipping containers had been converted into climate-controlled short-term storage units. The shop had a second repair bay, a parts inventory system, and a vehicle monitoring setup that fed real-time status updates to the dispatch board inside. The dispatch board was Dylan's. He had built the system himself over 4 months, not from a template, not from a manual, but from the specific operational needs of this specific yard, refined through every job they'd run since the storm. It tracked incoming requests, available equipment, crew assignments, client history, and billing. It was precise, and it was his, in the way that things become yours when you build them from scratch. On the morning of the opening, Ethan came into the dispatch office and found Dylan at the board running through the day's scheduled jobs. He waited until Dylan had finished the check, then crossed the room and held out a key. Dylan looked at it. "Office is yours," Ethan said. "You run operations. I'll handle the mechanical side and client relationships. But this," he gestured at the board, the desk, the whole carefully constructed system. "This is your department." Dylan took the key. He turned it over once in his hand, the same unconscious gesture Ethan had used with the old wrench and Raymond before him. 3 generations of men holding small objects that meant large things. "Don't let it go to your head," Ethan said. "Too late," Dylan said. But he was looking at the board, not at his father. And his voice was steady and quiet and sure. The voice of someone who had found the thing they were meant to do and was already thinking about what came next.
On the corner of the dispatch desk, within arm's reach, sat Raymond's old wrench. Dylan had put it there on the first day he moved in. He hadn't moved it since. Diana came to the opening as a partner, not a guest. She stood near the back of the small gathering, a few dozen drivers' local contacts, the Tulsa carrier who'd been with them since the beginning, and watched the yard operate. She watched Dylan work the board with the ease of someone who'd been doing it for years. She watched Ethan move through the space with the unhurried authority of a man who understood every inch of what he'd built. At one point, she drifted toward the old shop wall, the original building, the one that had been there when she first came to the yard. She stopped near the spot where she'd seen Ethan crouching that first day, reaching past the oil cans for the worn wrench. She stood there for a moment, in the noise and movement of the opening, and felt something settle. She had built her company on the premise that value was visible, that you could assess a property, a person, a situation, and arrive at an accurate number. She was good at it. She had been good at it for a long time, but she understood now what she'd missed that first day. Value isn't always visible from the gate. Some things only reveal themselves to the person patient enough or stubborn enough to stay and look harder. Across the yard, Ethan stood alone for a moment near the gate. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out his father's notebook. He opened it to the last page, Raymond's final entry, the careful handwriting that had documented 3 decades of a man refusing to quit. Below it, in Ethan's own hand, was the date he'd written the night of the first real call. And below that, a few lines he'd added since. Jobs completed, problem solved. The slow accumulation of a record that was beginning to look like his father's, and nothing like it at the same time. He closed the notebook. He carried it inside, set it in the top drawer of the desk in his office, and pushed the drawer shut. It wasn't finished. It would never be finished. But it was time to stop carrying it and start adding to it. Not as a reminder of where he'd come from, but as the first volume of something that was only just beginning. He went back out into the yard, where there was work to do. There's a version of this story where Ethan sells the yard, takes the $40,000, and finds something safer to do with his life. Nobody would have blamed him. The numbers made sense. The logic was sound. But Ethan understood something that doesn't show up on a balance sheet, that real value rarely looks like much from the outside. It looks like rust and weeds and a sagging roof. It looks like a bad investment. It looks like something you should walk away from. The people who build things worth having are usually the ones who looked at exactly that and stayed anyway. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories about ordinary people who built something real from nothing, subscribe. There are more where this came from.